Hey listeners, make sure to check out our 2-week free trial for unlimited yoga, breathwork, and Ayurveda on betteryoga.net.
Hello and welcome everybody to the Better Yoga podcast. My name is Tiger Bai, and today we have a very special guest with us. Today we are featuring Patrick McKeown, who is the creator, CEO, and director of education and training at Oxygen Advantage, the director of education and training at Buteyko Clinic International, as well as the president of Buteyko Professionals International. He is a leading international expert on breathing and sleep and author of best-selling books, including The Oxygen Advantage. His focus is to empower more people every day to breathe better, feel better, and achieve their potential. Patrick's interest in breath training began when he discovered the Buteyko breathing method at age 26. After a lifetime of asthma medication and inhalers, he found immediate relief from his symptoms and has remained asthma-free ever since. He traveled to Moscow, Russia to learn from Dr. Konstantin Buteyko and was accredited to teach the Buteyko method in 2002. Since then, Patrick has been deeply committed to communicating his knowledge to the people who need it. He is passionate about conveying the importance of breath therapy in traditional healthcare and sports coaching, and he is determined to break down barriers that prevent an accessible, holistic, empowering approach to well-being and performance. For a little bit of context, I first came into communication with Patrick when I was a grad student at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., and part of my public health degree involved a practicum or an internship, and I reached out to Patrick, having been a yoga teacher, very interested in breathing and understanding the science behind breath work, and asked if there was anything he might possibly need help with. And he very generously said yes, there was a project I could help him work on. And ever since then, Patrick has just been a very important teacher to me, really helping me weave and braid together the ancient arts, yoga, breathing, Ayurveda, with the more scientific bolstering counterparts. So Patrick has been very instrumental in helping me really understand breathing, both from the ancient and traditional perspective, but as well, most importantly, as with the scientific perspective. And we are so glad to have him on the podcast because we really have an overlapping goal. Better Yoga's slogan is move better, breathe better, feel better. And I've heard Patrick say several times one of his missions is breath to the people, like getting people breathing better. And I could not agree more on that democratic premise. And I'm so happy to have you here. Welcome, Patrick. So, Patrick, we start every podcast asking people the same question, and you are free to interpret as you may. But my question to you is, what does your daily practice look like?
My daily practice, Tiger, and I have to admit it, I haven't always been able to get practice in. There were a few years, it was absolutely crazy with workload. And a point came that I was feeling, I was putting all my energy out there and I wasn't giving myself any energy. So I started then thinking about, well, how can I carve my day up that I can give myself some attention? I'm sure there's plenty of people in the same boat. So I only do one thing every morning and I have to do it. And that's 30 minutes on a cross trainer or an elliptical. And I do that every morning without fail. That has to happen. Even this morning I got delayed. I had a meeting and I still do the 30 minutes. And then normally what I do in the afternoon is I do 20 minutes of relaxation and really quiet breathing as a rest and reset. And that's my practice. Now, throughout the day, I try not to live in my head. I spent many years stuck in my head. And at different times throughout the day, I will actually bring my attention into my body and onto my breath and, to reduce thought activity and bring my attention into the moment, but without looking or without being present through the veil of thinking. So that's my practice. And I think for anybody, the practice is whatever you're able to put into it without force, something that you just become accustomed to.
And I am a strong believer that changing your breath for one breath can be a form of a breathwork practice. So the fact that you're dedicating 30 minutes, no doubt, to exercise, but also I'm sure thinking about how you're breathing when you're exercising is a full practice, if you ask me.
Yeah, you know what? I actually should have said that, because when I'm on the elliptical, I sometimes do it with my eyes closed. And the reason I do it on that machine instead of a treadmill is because I can't do the treadmill with my eyes closed because I'm likely to fall off it. But at least when I'm holding onto the bars, I'm able to close my eyes and I bring my attention inwards. And I actually use it as a meditation. I use it as a breathing exercise. So for me, it's my formal meditation because my attention is on the breath. With every breath, of course, the mind wanders off. It's also a physical exercise, and I also nose breathe and do some breath holds, so it's a breathing exercise as well. So that's why it's quite important for me anyway.
Yes, there are a million ways to meditate, and I find too that meditations in motion can be a real way to braid the body-mind together. So I think that's fabulous.
Sure.
So I mentioned a little bit in your bio about you discovering the Buteyko breathing method. Could you tell us a little bit more about your genesis into breath training?
I came into breathing by simply reading a newspaper article. Now, I had read a book called Calm by Paul Wilson. I practiced that technique. I practiced a few small techniques. I never found anything that worked for me. I remember going into a university exam and I was feeling quite stressed. And I started taking these full deep breaths for 2 minutes as I went for a walk. And I was a little bit all over the place and lightheaded when I went into the exam. And what's worse, it took me quite a few minutes to get my head together. It's not what you want going into an exam. But I then came across a newspaper article, and I came across a similar article sometime later. And it was about the work of a Ukrainian doctor. He said two things: breathe in and out through the nose. I was hardly ever breathing in and out through my nose. I always had nasal congestion. I had an operation on my nose in '94, but the good surgeon, although he fixed my nose, he never told me to actually breathe through it. And I continuously breathed through an open mouth. He said your breathing should be light. In other words, you shouldn't be hearing your breathing. You shouldn't hardly feel it. Your breathing should be effortless. It's almost like your breathing should be undetectable. Breathing should be imperceptible. And mine wasn't that way. You could always hear my breathing because I was a heavy breather. Mouth breather, fast breather, upper chest breather, dysfunctional breather. Of course, nobody had ever told me that in my 26 years or 20, whatever it was, 25 years at the time. So I started putting it into practice. And it was a couple of years later then that I really decided, I said, I kind of got a feeling that I'd love to bring this to Ireland, the Buteyko method. So I reached out to the Russian embassy because I had no way of contacting Dr. Buteyko. They were able to locate him. They put me in touch with him, and then through an interpreter, I was able to go over there. So that was it, and the rest is history, you know. A crazy move, but like anything crazy, most of us go into teaching breathing because of our own personal background. Or, you know, a lot of psychologists will go into psychology because they want to use what they learn to address their own mind first. So we do have a personal motive. So that's how I got into breathing. It was never really to teach anybody else. It was to teach myself first.
Yes. You're somewhat of a breath diplomat as well. It's not a short trip to go to Russia.
Yeah, I felt it was the right thing to. Well, you know, it's that saying, isn't it? Whenever you're doing something, give it your best shot, and you're as well off going to the source. You know, so like it was like anything that I try to do, I try and give it my best shot. So yeah, that was the trip there, because there's always nuances as well you pick up on that you might necessarily get. And like I was fortunate, Dr. Buteyko passed on a year later. You know, so that was just crazy.
Wow. Well, my family has a motto, for better or for worse. It's, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. That works.
Most of the time. um, so at this point, you have experience working with thousands upon thousands of people globally. What is the most common misunderstanding or myth you've come across about how we breathe?
Oh, sure. It goes without saying, the instruction to take a deep breath. That simple instruction could be the most harmful instruction anybody ever gave. And the instruction is fine, but it's the interpretation of it. That's what's open to question. And also the belief, Tiger, that, we believe in the Western world that the bigger the better. The more, the better. But whereas with breathing, that's not the way. Taking a full, deep breath. Why do we do that? Why do we need to do it? What's it achieving? Is it achieving what the instructor, the practitioner, thinks it's achieving? And that's what breathing. People who are teaching breathing, they should really understand what's actually happening. And it's not a criticism. It's just, for people to start questioning, if you're giving a breathing instruction, what really is happening with that instruction? And more importantly, how is the student interpreting her instruction?
Yes, and it's ubiquitous in the world of yoga, and just about every public class you'll encounter that instruction. Take a big deep breath into the blank, into the lungs, into the chest, into the belly. The metaphor that comes to my mind is, people get certified to drive a car, they get a license, but they're not required to understand how the car works in order to drive it. And many yoga breathing certifications are the same. People have a piece of paper saying they're allowed to go teach this, but they don't necessarily understand it enough to truly help their students. I've
there's
noticed.
even more, Tiger.
Like, the way I look at it is, imagine if I was a student of yoga and I was going in with my history of asthma, and I was going in with my chronic mouth breathing, my faster breathing and upper chest breathing, my stuffy nose, and I had poor sleep. I'm going into that yoga class with an aim to feel better. But if the yoga instructor didn't talk about breathing in and out through the nose, didn't show me how to decongest the nose, didn't show me how to breathe through my nose during wakefulness outside the yoga studio, in other words, how to breathe off the mat, talk about breathing during sleep, that if I was feeling queasy, is there a breathing exercise that you can help to do? So imagine a yoga instructor armed with that information, so that somebody coming in with asthma, given that asthma affects about 8% of the Western population. Now, the same idea, though, applies to somebody going in with panic disorder, that there can be very targeted breathing exercises that are brought into yoga to get to that person. And the same with sleep, the same with anxiety, the same with depression, the same with PTSD. So there's so much that a targeted approach with breathing could really benefit the person. And more importantly than this, I made mistakes with teaching breathing exercises. If I'm working with somebody with panic disorder, it's a totally different ballgame than working with somebody with asthma or working with somebody with sleep apnea. So, it's not just that we can get a better effect by knowing what breathing exercises to tailor to the population. More importantly is, it's safer.
Absolutely. And what you're saying really corresponds to something I believe, which is that a yoga practice is 95% off the mat. And the asana, the physical postures, the pranayama, the breathing exercises we do in a distinct class is just the tip of the iceberg. And having people be instructed in a way where they leave the class but take something with them to understand about their breath, their body, the other 23 hours of the day is is just crucial. And it, you know, at Better Yoga, we really believe like you don't do yoga to become good at yoga. Ultimately, who cares what shape you can put your body in? You practice yoga to be good at life. And breathing, of course, is a huge component of a yoga practice. And it doesn't matter, you know, how long can I hold my breath? How much can I inflate my lungs? Like, what practices am I doing to support how my instinctual breath responds in situations that are not in an enclosed space, that are indeed out of my control? And I think that's the real purpose and beauty of what you call functional breathing, or what Oxygen Advantage method would call functional breathing. And, you know, for somebody new to breath training, perhaps you could take us into the key differences between functional breathing and other breathing techniques they might have come across in yoga or meditation.
I suppose you can look at any breathing exercise and ultimately you can break it down. Like, can we work with the breath? When any of us change our own breathing and we communicate to the body what way to breathe, okay, you can breathe faster or you can breathe slower. Okay, so you can change your respiratory rate. You could take a fuller breath, or you can take a lighter breath, so you can change tidal volume. You can stop breathing at the top of the inhale, or you can stop breathing at the bottom of the inhale. You could stop breathing for a short period of time. You could stop breathing for a long period of time. That's pretty much it. That's all you can do with breathing. So then you have to think about, well, how long do I breathe faster for? Or how long do I breathe lighter for? And what sequence of exercises do I bring this together? So if I wanted to do an exercise to upregulate and downregulate, you could have a sequence of breathing fast for 20 breaths and then breathing light and slow for 3 minutes to downregulate. So any breathing exercise on the planet, you're breaking it down into those components. And then if you're looking at the effect that that's having on the body, well, from a biochemical point of view, and really the biochemistry is referring to oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitric oxide. So is there a way to breathe to harness nasal nitric oxide? Yes. Breath holding, slow breathing, humming. Is there a way to breathe to dump carbon dioxide, to blow off too much carbon dioxide? Yes, that would happen if you hyperventilate. Even with slow breathing, you can still hyperventilate because the tidal volume can be quite high. Is there a way to breathe less air to increase carbon dioxide in the lungs and blood? And yes, you can. That would be hypoventilating by breathing less air. And that could be achieved by either reducing the respiratory rate and or reducing the tidal volume to reduce minute ventilation. In other words, breathing less air. So that's the biochemical department or dimension. The second dimension then is the biomechanical dimension. And that's going to equate to whether we are breathing high in the upper chest or whether we are breathing low in different positions, while sitting, while standing, while lying on our backs, for example. And then we have the psychophysiological dimension. So this is the top-down communication, the instruction that we can give to our breath, that we can change breathing in whatever way we can change it, as based on the parameters that we can tolerate. So some people can hold their breath for a very short period of time. Some people can hold their breath for a long period of time. There's many factors that are feeding into the drive to breathe. It's not just, of course, carbon dioxide, but carbon dioxide is the primary stimulus. But there's a lot more factors there as well. So in terms of the psychophysiological dimension, it's the communication from the body up to the brain. So it's the bottom-up communication, and that is the communication from the brain to the body, top-down communication. So ultimately, any breathing exercise on the planet that anybody can think of, well, ultimately, it's going to fall into that category. So we could be the author of any breathing exercise, absolutely anything, because ultimately, it has to meet a certain few conditions anyway. And I think there's a simplicity in that, but there's a complexity in it as well. Because a lot of people,
You don't say.
when they teach about breathing, it's really about taking that deep dive in terms of, like the exercise that I love the biochemical dimension. I love the hypoventilation. It's my go-to. And That's whereby I simply take a shorter breath in through my nose, about 70% of the breath in. I have a relaxed and slow, gentle breath out. My objective is to do it purely with relaxation and just mental encouragement, to take less air into the body, to feel an air hunger for a short period of time. So that would be biochemical dimension of breathing. Or I like to do long breath holds. This is the stressor exercise. But typically I will do it after an exhalation because there's less stress in the heart. And also you've got a more concentration of carbon dioxide. You can lower your blood oxygen saturation quicker. And also if you hold your breath after exhalation, then when you resume breathing, you harness nasal nitric oxide that is accumulated in the nose during the breath hold, and you're carrying that nitric oxide into the lungs, where it will help to bronchodilate and help open up the blood vessels in the lungs, etc. So, there's something about breathing and that our own personal preferences come into it as well. And oftentimes I think our own personality comes into it. So an individual who is quite extroverted, an individual who loves to push the boundaries, they're not going to work with a gentle breathing technique. They're going to have, a stressor breathing exercise, probably more likely, hyperventilation, long breath holds. Whereas somebody else who is kind of maybe more into, not necessarily the extremes, but maybe the middle road, they will be bringing in lighter breathing, slower breathing, and it's deeper breathing. No, I'm not going to generalize. Of course, there's exceptions to every rule. But there's always a few things to take into consideration. So if you were a student and you were being taught a breathing practice, one, you have to ask a few questions. What knowledge base does the instructor have? And also, what's the personality of the instructor? Where did the breathing technique originate? Is the breathing technique true to the source? Or has it been changed? Because even in yoga breathing changed immensely in 1880, immensely. It's almost like night and day. And even the history of yoga is quite complex. What we regard, and I'm a beginner student. I'm hardly a beginner. I'm not even a half a beginner student to yoga. That's what I know about it. I do it every now and again. I think it's absolutely wonderful. And in terms of the history of it, when I had met Magdalena Crawler, she'd written a PhD on yoga breath. And of course, Robin Rottenberg, from years past and continuously, I correspond with her. In that, when I looked at Magdalena Crawler's PhD, which is available, yoga breathing, whether it has originated 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, nobody seems to know. So the history is not absolutely certain. But the one thing that does seem to come true is that there was an emphasis placed on the conservation of the breath, that the breath should be so subtle, that the breath should be light, that human being, the objective is that he who breathes the least lives the longest. And I'm not just talking about as measuring that in the respiratory rate, but I'm talking about minute volume. But the two do tend to go hand in hand. Whereas in the 1880s, when tuberculosis was rampant in Europe and people were dying with the condition and the respiratory system was affected, an idea took hold in the hygienic movement that he who breathes more air lives the longest. He who breathes the most air lives the longest. Taking full deep breaths, ventilating all regions of the lungs will help to prevent germs from spreading throughout the lungs. But of course, the proponents back in 1880 didn't consider that if you breathe more air than what your metabolism requires, you blow off too much carbon dioxide from the lungs because you're breathing it from the body into the atmosphere. And if you reduce carbon dioxide in the lungs, you are going to reduce the carbon dioxide in the blood leaving the lungs. And now your blood circulation is going to be constricted, so your reduced blood circulation. You've got reduced oxygen delivery because of the Bohr effect. You've got an increased sympathetic drive because of the alkalization as a result of the loss of carbon dioxide and the increase of blood pH. You've got reduced blood flow to the brain, reduced oxygen delivery to the brain, increasing neuronal excitability. And I had a podcast with George Dallin there last week, and he's written a paper looking at endurance athletes who breathe too much air are more likely to have fibrosing of the heart, because when they breathe too much air during physical exercise, there's reduced blood flow and oxygen delivery to the heart. And even though there hasn't been a study putting two and two, together, but based on his decades as a sports scientist and his interest in nasal breathing since 2005 in sports, that I think there's some premise there that there could be a connection. It's not good to do any physical movement with a habit of breathing too much air over a period of time, because why should we be reducing blood flow and oxygen delivery? Why would we do that? If we knew what was happening, we wouldn't be encouraging it.
And what you're getting at is certainly reflected in yoga, which is that, we have pranayama, and pranayamas are really specific, targeted breathing techniques to change the state of the body-mind. But before people are encouraged to perform pranayama, really there is work to be done, preparatory work to be done in stabilizing the breath, nasal breathing, light, slow, deep breathing, and really energetically, this is to start to open and balance the channels through which energy flows in yoga. These are called the nadis. And pranayama really isn't this entry-level practice traditionally, but rather it's, the icing on the cake of the functional breathing, on the everyday breathing, on the setting the foundation, setting up the container. And really we can think about, yoga asana, the physical postures, as forming the cup, pranayama as filling the cup, and meditation as drinking the elixir. And it doesn't surprise me what you're saying about these athletes or these people who are more drawn to extremes, that they might be having adverse effects. Now, of course, plenty of people do these practices and are just fine. And in fact, they are, known to help several conditions. But there are people who simply aren't prepared for them. Their body is in no state or shape to be doing these highly transformative, energy shifting, biochemistry shifting, psychophysiological shifting practices. And that's, I think, where your work and my work really collide and eclipse. Is there are wonderful extreme practices people can be doing, or not even extreme, just heightened, highly energetic, but without the foundation, without being able to breathe through the nose, breathe quietly, recruit the diaphragm, understand how to use your breath in a situation that's stressful. All of that extra stuff isn't going to get you anywhere. And in fact, in some cases, might even be detrimental.
I think because if one is poor breathing, and what I'm talking about there is, say, abnormal breathing from a biochemical point of view, if that individual hyperventilates, and like anybody who hyperventilates, carbon dioxide reduces in the lungs and blood, but the person with poor breathing, it takes a lot longer for carbon dioxide to return back to baseline. And also they're more likely to experience more severe symptoms of vasoconstriction, because one of the first things that really gets impacted when you breathe a little bit faster and harder is that there's reduced blood flow to the brain. It's one of the most direct effects to it. But the individual who might be impacted the most there is going to be, well, I suppose somebody who is individually, if they have a genetic predisposition towards panic disorder or increased brain cell excitability, or say epilepsy or anything like that, but their underlying breathing pattern. Now, I will say this, so it's not that my preference on the personal individual, and this is where I was saying that the personality does come into breathing. And it's not just we as instructors, we have our own preferences, but students also are likely to have their own preferences. And this is where it's really good for the students to understand that it's almost that you a kind of a suite of techniques, a toolbox of different techniques. And it's really worth, practice different breathing exercises to see what you're getting out of it the most. Because, like, as I said to you earlier on, I did try a couple of different breathing techniques before I came across Buteyko. I didn't go into them in that much detail, but I got nothing out of them. And then I had an idea, well, that breathing is useless. Breathing is going to do nothing for me. Like, especially when I went into that exam, lightheaded and all over the place. And of course, it was likely that I was going to go into that exam hall lightheaded because I was already a dysfunctional breather. And now I'm after spending 2 minutes hyperventilating in the belief that I was getting more oxygen going to the brain. And of course, the opposite was happening. So it had a bigger impact on me. So for any student who is listening, who wants to bring breathing techniques into it, well, I think yoga asanas are a tremendous place that literally, it's like me on my little cross trainer, that I bring breathing into it. And why not target breathing from 3 dimensions and also bring the stressor exercises into the poses, doing breath holds. Really, I just think it could take it to a totally different level. And I think it could be interesting for the student because the one thing about the breath, you always have it and it's free and it's there for the rest of your life. So regardless of what's happening on the outside, you can always draw your attention inwards. But more importantly, it's a real direct access to the autonomic nervous system because, we were talking earlier on about what's happening in terms of, cultural norms and everything that's going on in the world around us. And there's a lot of stuff going on. And I think we need to be able to protect ourselves. Well, first of all, it's good to turn off the news. That's always a good thing. But aside from not letting much information in, how about giving ourselves some attention and telling the brain that we are safe and using breathing as a means of doing that?
This episode of the Better Yoga Podcast is brought to you by our friends at Banyan Botanicals. Use the code KARI15 for 15% off their amazing Ayurvedic products. That's KARI 15. Don't forget to use the link in our show notes.
Couldn't agree more. I particularly am very interested in the merging of oxygen advantage techniques, functional breathing, as well as the stressor exercises in yoga asana. One, because simply people don't have a ton of free time. Like, thinking about adding on another 30 minutes of a breathwork practice, for some people, they'll just laugh at you. They're like, I barely have time to feed my kids, let alone set up a yoga mat to breathe. But, for a lot of people, and as, you too on the cross trainer, people are already doing some sort of physical exercise. They're already getting on their yoga mat to stretch, to open up the body. It's the containers right there. And it doesn't take extra time, simply attention and the wherewithal to add another layer that can actually, in my opinion, shave off some time needed to participate in physical exercise. I mean, if you're adding on breath holds on a cross trainer or on a yoga mat or in your daily sprints, whatever kind of movement you happen to be doing, and your breathing is good enough to start adding these stressor exercises, you don't need to be working out for 90 minutes. 30 minutes is plenty. And I want to backtrack to, you had mentioned panic attacks and PTSD, and this conversation has been threaded with the topic of stress and how ubiquitous it is for anybody these days. We know breath is closely linked to stress levels. Can you tell us a little bit more about what role breath plays in mental health, particularly when it comes to conditions like panic attacks, PTSD, where the fight or flight response is triggered?
Well, I think it has a fundamental role. I think all of those, any life challenges is going to influence breathing. So breathing is influenced by the situations that we find ourselves in. Anytime that we get into a difficult situation, it's likely that our breathing is going to change because our brain is interpreting that there is a threat to the body. So automatically our breathing is getting faster and harder. And we revert back to the primitive way fight or flight responds. Now, if we have a chronic difficult situation, well, our breathing pattern then is going to change over a period of time and stay that way. And then the body develops a habit of breathing that way all the time. And even when the difficult situation is removed from our life, our poor breathing pattern will continue. And our poor breathing pattern then is feeding into a stress response. So it's not just that stress impacts our breathing. How we breathe is going to influence and tell the brain whether we are under threat or whether we are safe. And if we look at the people of breathing coming in with panic disorder, and I've worked a lot with panic disorder, it was a group that I found most challenging because I made most of my mistakes. And in 2010, I worked with 3,000 individuals in small little group workshops over 3 years. So Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Galway, I was driving all the time. And I put out Buteyko mindfulness method. People didn't know so much about Buteyko, but they knew about mindfulness. So I put it out that mindfulness was the draw to come in the door. But when you come in for your mindfulness, I was teaching you breathing practice to self-regulate. Now, aside from 95% of the people coming in being female, and of course, Oxygen Advantage was born out of that because we wanted something for a male audience. But let's look at how breathing could help somebody with panic disorder or somebody with dysregulation of the autonomic nervous system, as implied in, say, PTSD, etc., poor sleep. Number one is we can improve blood flow to the brain. And carbon dioxide is known as a narcotic gas. And even the paper written back in 1988 by Somnin and Balestrino, the brain, by controlling breathing, regulates its own excitability. So how does the brain, by controlling breathing, regulates its own excitability? That's all related to carbon dioxide. Now, of course, there's the vagus nerve and there's other aspects getting in there, playing the amygdala, etc., etc. But a fundamental component is that if we breathe lighter and take less air into the body, the carbon dioxide produced by the body doesn't leave the body so quickly. So then it accumulates in the lungs, it accumulates in the blood, and it increases blood flow to the brain. I had a class of 20 people about an hour ago. I had them do the breathe out exercise. I had them breathe less air for a period of 5 minutes. We did plenty of practical sessions. And I explained, it's likely that the blood flow to your brain is increasing by 5 to 10% during this exercise. So where do you get that statistic from? Every 1 millimeter increase of CO2 in the blood will increase blood flow to the brain by 3%. Now, typically it takes about 1 minute. That when you breathe light, it takes about 1 minute for the accumulation of carbon dioxide. Firstly, it happens in the lungs, and then it happens in the blood leaving the lungs. So you need to be doing the exercise for more than 1 minute. The key is to achieve a level of air hunger that you're comfortable with. That's the key. And if the air hunger is too much, you have involuntary contractions of the diaphragm. There's a slight discomfort with air hunger. It's a sensation of suffocation. People don't like that word, but people with panic disorder have a heightened fear response to the feeling of air hunger. So we deliberately put them into a controlled state of air hunger, a teaspoon of air hunger, to help desensitize their body's reaction to their fear of suffocation. Because they could be walking down the street and something could trigger them, and all of a sudden they're feeling air hunger or feeling suffocated, and a natural response to that would be to breathe hard and faster. But of course, this is going to tip you into a fight or flight response. So you can imagine then that if they do feel air hunger in their everyday life, their body doesn't react to it in the same stress response. Now, very often that part of breathing is all forgotten about, the biochemical dimension. So then we think about breathing in and out through the nose. If you breathe in and out through the nose imposes a resistance to your breathing that's 2 to 3 times that of the mouth. It's a very different breath. It's a deeper breath. And when I mean a deeper breath, it means that the air is going into the lower regions of the lungs and you have a better connection with the diaphragm with nasal breathing, you have a slower breath. So now you're thinking about nose flow and low breathing, and that in turn helps to stimulate the vagus nerve because of the connection between the vagus nerve innervating the diaphragm, and also the connection between the diaphragm and the mind itself. So another aspect of that would be is, of course, if you're doing breathing practice, it gets your attention out of your head. You cannot think and hold your attention on your breath at the same time. And initially, of course, when people start off, they are observing their breath through thinking. There's my breath coming in and there's my breath leaving. But eventually, thinking mind subsides, and the person then is directly connected to their breath in the absence of thought. And as long as they're connected to their breath in the absence of thought, they're not stuck in their heads. Another aspect then would be improved sleep quality, because I feel there's a huge connection there as well that's often overlooked. So when anybody has panic disorder or anxiety or racing mind or high stress, sleep is impacted. And if sleep then is not deep, the brain isn't cleaning itself, the person spends more time in light sleep, less time in deep sleep, they're waking up feeling unrefreshed, and then they're not able to cope with the daily challenges that life throws upon them. So I suppose in short, Tiger, there's a few things going on there. One is, there is a way to breathe, to increase blood flow to the brain. Very important. It has a calming effect and reduces brain cell excitability. Number two, by breathing with a tolerable feeling of air hunger, you help to desensitize the body's reaction to suffocation. You're surrendering to the discomfort. And it's very important then that if you do experience suffocation in your everyday life, you're able to cope with it better. Number three, when you practice breathe light or breathing less air, you have to reduce your chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. Your drive to breathe is reduced. That means that your breathing is naturally lighter and slower. That in turn helps to induce relaxation. And very often people who have had trauma in their lives, they've got a heightened sensitivity to carbon dioxide. And that heightened sensitivity to carbon dioxide induces faster breathing and harder breathing. So it's almost as if they're breathing, and how they are breathing, they are telling the brain continuously that their body is under threat. And the brain is just reacting. So the brain reads how we breathe. So it's very important to be able to tell the brain that we're safe, but it's very important that our everyday breathing is in a way that we are telling the brain that we are safe. And then, of course, the connection between the nose and the diaphragm and the mind, the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is not just stimulated by diaphragmatic breathing or by slow breathing, but it's also stimulated by carbon dioxide. So there's a number of ways to stimulate the vagus nerve to secrete the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which in turn brings the heart rate, a slowing of the heart rate, which in turn then, of course, the brain interprets that the body is safe. And then strengthening the baroreflex, the pressure receptors in the major blood vessels. So by increasing the sensitivity of the baroreflex, which in turn is related to the chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide, the autonomic nervous system is in balance, or at least in a better balance, and it's not an increased sympathetic drive and a reduced parasympathetic drive. And finally, sleep. So you're probably sorry that you asked me that question, Tiger, but you can see the potential of breathing here for somebody with panic disorder. And even though it sounds complex when I'm talking, I'm going through all of those things, you can still easily impart all of those benefits to somebody during a yoga class.
I agree. And, for people who may be listening to this, resonating with those heightened feelings of sensitivity to air hunger, sensitivity to that feeling of suffocation, and wondering, well, how sensitive am I to the gas carbon dioxide? Would you mind breaking down the measurement you use to help people understand and improve their chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide, the BOLT score, BOLT?
Yes, so we used the BOLT. So the name BOLT came from, was actually Tom Heron, one of our instructors, who was a psychotherapist. And it's also derived from the Buteyko method, the control pause. It's known since 1975, or even before that the length of your breath over time gives you feedback of your chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. Now, there is more to it than just the chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. But the one thing about the BOLT score is you're only holding the breath until the first definite desire to breathe. So it's not influenced by willpower or determination. So the measurement goes as follows. One takes a normal breath in and out through their nose, and they pinch their nose with their fingers, and they time it in seconds. How long can they hold their breath for and still have normal breathing when they resume breathing? And that's a key part of it, still having normal breathing when they resume breathing. A person with a strong chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide will have a lower breath hold time. And I would expect it, not all, but a lot of people with panic disorder, and I have 20 people with panic disorder either tomorrow or Friday. And I will tell you what sort of breathing pattern would be most evident. I will see that they will be breathing faster. They will be breathing harder. They will be breathing upper chest. They will be sighing frequently. Many of them will tell me that they can't take a satisfying breath. Most of their BOLT scores will range from between 8 seconds to probably about 17 seconds. There will be a few outliers. Some people will have decent enough breathing, even though they are prone to panic disorder, but the vast majority of them won't. That's interesting about breathing. And of course, I can never say it's never going to be 100%, but it's just in general, when you're working with that group of people, well, it kind of makes sense anyway. This is the cycle that's going on. Breathing is feeding into the condition. And if the person has a panic attack, what is the one thing that's impacted the most? Their breathing. And how do they feel? Suffocated. And they feel they are going to die. So as a result then, all it would take is for any of us to have a couple of bad attacks of panic disorder, and then we have a very delicate relationship with our breathing, a very poor relationship with our breathing, because we just cannot trust our breathing, because our breathing has let us down. And it's not that our breathing has let us down. Our breathing has given us an experience that hasn't been an altogether nice experience. And then when we tap in on our breathing, it just could bring back those memories. So this is where, when we're working with anybody, and it does come back to whatever you decide as a student in terms of breathing, dip your toes into the water first, because you don't know how your body reacts. And go back to your point, don't automatically go for the stressor breathing exercises because they're sexy and they're better known. There's a lot of subtle exercises that are absolutely wonderful. People won't even know what you're doing. And before you go into anything that you're pushing it, start off walking first. Walk before you sprint.
Good advice for sure. And, it's not necessarily just people with high anxiety, panic disorder, PTSD that, we've seen with lower BOLT scores or high sensitivity to CO2. You've done extensive work with athletes and high performers, and, people even in this category aren't necessarily having optimized breathing. And maybe you could tell us some of the immediate benefits you see people in these realms getting when they start to improve their CO2 tolerance.
Well, it's a measure of functional breathing. And if I look at Kyle Kiesel's paper, he looked at 51 individuals, and he's a professor of physical therapy. And in his study that's published, his conclusion was that your breath hold time, BOLT score, control pause, it should be greater than 25 seconds. And that indicates that there's an 89% chance that your breathing is functional. Now, what would it mean if an athlete has dysfunctional breathing? It just would mean that they're pushing themselves that bit faster and harder to attain what they want to achieve. So, say, for example, they're not going to be as efficient with their breathing. They're wasting energy unnecessary. They can be reducing blood flow and oxygen delivery. This was the conversation I had with George Dallin. And he was talking about endurance athletes. These are guys and girls who are running marathons, for example, doing a lot of endurance running. But what about the individual with dysfunctional breathing who is running marathons? Can they still run marathons? Of course they can. but what impact is that having on their body? And could they be overdoing it? So it's always about, you can achieve what you want to achieve during physical exercise, even with poor breathing, even though I would, in general, expect poor breathing to hold you back. But there's a time that poor breathing can catch up with you. And if we look at the paper that was published in Japan, looking at 1,933 athletes, 90% of those athletes, irrespective of the team that they were in, the sports that they were in, or the age group, had dysfunctional breathing from a biochemical point of view. Now, if you're breathing high, it means that you have suboptimal recruitment of the diaphragm. And of course, the diaphragm breathing muscle isn't just for respiration, but it provides stabilization for the spine. And there's a relationship between breathing and movement. And if breathing is dysfunctional, movement is dysfunctional. And if movement is dysfunctional, the athlete is more at risk of injury. So athletes will get by, but it doesn't mean that it won't impact them. Their recovery may not be the same. Their sleep may not be the same. Their stress levels could be higher. They could be at risk of overtraining, and they could be experiencing muscle fatigue, cramping, diaphragmatic fatigue, and increased risk of injury. Exercise-induced bronchoconstriction, that's related to overbreathing, hyperventilation. The airways are not able to cope with the volume of air that's coming into the lungs. They dry out, they cool, they narrow, and the athlete has exercise-induced bronchoconstriction. So yeah, it's an interesting question because, somebody could say, well, here's an athlete and they have a bold score of 15 seconds and they just ran a marathon and they won it. Well, okay, that can happen. That can happen, but watch that space.
Yeah. When I first read that paper out of Japan, my jaw hit the floor.
It's shocking.
It's absolutely shocking, especially given, this study was done not just in one sport, but various sports, very different kinds of athleticism. No matter what kind of athlete you are, no matter what kind of human being you are, if you are not recruiting the diaphragm, you are a fundamentally less stable individual. And just think about that language. Like you're talking about these ultra runners or these marathon runners, possibly just burning out from having to work that much harder without having the breathing on their side. Like they're not as stable, literally. And, the human body, human brains, they're amazing. They can achieve absolutely unbelievable things. If you asked me to run a marathon, it would be very, very hard to convince me to do so. But people do these amazing things, and it makes me feel so excited about where the world of breath training is going, because as more elite athletes and more recreational athletes start to understand how to get breathing on their side, the thought of what is possible just becomes more exponential, and that's very exciting to me, to see where that's going to go with more people getting on the breath training train. So if you could give just one actionable tip or practice for listeners who are brand new to breath training, they've just heard this word in this podcast, what is one thing you would encourage them to begin implementing today to improve their overall breathing habits and therefore their well-being?
I think you guessed it, you know what I'm going to say. What do you think I'm going to say?
I think I know where you're going to point.
Totally.
It's a foundation that has to be breathing in and out through the nose, and in and out through the nose, Tiger. Not in through the nose and out through the mouth, not in through the mouth and out through the mouth. And ultimately, we have to think about what's inside the nose, what's inside the mouth. There is nothing inside the mouth that serves any purpose for breathing. And so for rest, during physical exercise, during sleep, one should never wake up with a dry mouth in the morning. Our nose is for breathing. Even if we just start with that, it's a great start. And pay attention to your breathing. It's a great place to be able to bring your attention out of your mind and into the body. In your everyday life, not just when somebody is doing a formal meditation. But as you said at the very start, meditation isn't just one that's done in the formal sitting. Our life is a meditation. And we've got two options here in our short journey here in life. We can either live in our head and be asleep to everything that's going on around us because all of our attention is stuck in our head and we're not even seeing or hearing or feeling what's going on around us. Or we can be bringing our attention onto the breath, into the body, and connecting with life through that. But yeah, nose breathing is the place to start with. In and out through the nose.
Couldn't agree more. So on this podcast, we like to end with this question. If you weren't a breath professional, what would you want to be doing?
I would be an architect. And I have an interest on the side, designing buildings.
Well, we'll have to talk about that at some point in the future. So thank you so much, Patrick, for coming on and sharing your immense knowledge and wisdom in regards to breathing. Just so people can know, Oxygen Advantage has an incredible app. You can get it on iPhone, Android. Please download it. All of these practices Patrick has mentioned are explained, demonstrated for you right on the app. It's completely free, so I highly recommend downloading the Oxygen Advantage app and maybe the Better Yoga app while you're at it.
Absolutely.
And then you can, and then you can find Patrick as well and his courses at oxygenadvantage.com, at Oxygen Advantage on Instagram, and now you have your own Instagram at Patrick McKeown Official. It's official.
Yeah, and God only knows what's on it because I have no apps on my phone. I have no social media on my phone. I have a few apps and I don't even use them. Right there, I suppose, is the only ones I use. So yeah. So Patrick McKeown.